Today's scripture will be read from Luke 4:16 to 32. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up and read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he had anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoner, and to recover the sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue was fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote the Proverbs to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you have did in Capernaum.' Truly, I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah times, when the sky was shut up for 3.5 years, and there were severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy, and in that time of Elijah the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. And the people in the synagogue was furious when they heard this. They got up and drove him out of the town and took him to the brow of the hill in which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Then he went down to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath he taught the people. They were amazed in his teaching, because his word has authority. May the Lord add a blessing to this word.
Amen.
So as I had said earlier, Pastor Tim and Claudette are out of town, and so we have a guest speaker. We have Reverend Nancy Bickel, who's currently retired. She served 26 years as co-pastor with her husband Ken at First Congregational UCC. So without further ado, Reverend Nancy Bickel, thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning. It's so good to be with you this morning on this very rainy day, but I always think for all of us who love the church so much that wherever two or three are gathered in his name, when we sing the songs of faith and when we hear God's holy word proclaimed, there is sunshine in this place. So it's good to be with you this morning. They say home is where the heart is. But what exactly does that mean? During the last couple of weeks in July, our entire family headed to the East Coast for our annual vacation at my youngest sister's beach home in Avalon, New Jersey. We always love our time in Avalon, New Jersey. We play spike or bocce ball on the beach, cool off in the ocean, walk the boardwalk in the evening, and share all of our meals together as family. My sister's home is a beautiful place. It's a lovely house, but well, it isn't our home. On the weekend, we headed to Weisport, Pennsylvania, to Ken's home church to celebrate the life of his sister who passed away this last May. The aging congregation welcomed my husband, Kenny, as he's fondly referred to there, and his entire family with open arms. The memorial service for my sister-in-law was wonderful, and we enjoyed time catching up with old friends as well as former parishioners of ours. But well, Jacob's United Church of Christ hasn't been our home for a very long time. The last week of our vacation was spent cleaning out Ken's sister's home. We sold numerous items to friends and neighbors, boxed up several truckloads of stuff for the church's rummage sales in town, and packed our van full of those things that we just couldn't part with. On the last day, after we had cleaned the entire house from top to bottom, my husband and I looked at each other with longing in our voices and concurred, it's time to go home. How often have you gone on world travels or been called away and that indescribable desire comes over you that tugs at your heartstrings saying, it's time to go home. We are driving through a horrendous thunderstorm or a blizzard, and we can't wait until we pull in the driveway and make a mad dash into the sanctuary of our home, where we can pull down the windows and batten down the hatches against the storms of life. We are returning from a vacation and driving those last 50 miles across pot-bellied holes in the Route 20, and we think how wonderful it will be to sleep in our own bed, drink our own iced tea, watch our own local news, sit in our favorite recliner with our faithful dog or cat by our side, and yes, even use our own toilet. Home elicits an emotional, sensual response from us. We can see the colors of the walls. We can see the dishes, even the quirky places we inhabit. We can conjure up the smells of brewed coffee or cigar smoke, of pine sol or doggy dander. We can taste the treats in the cookie jar or our favorite go-to casserole. We can feel our lumpy pillow or our comfy slippers. Of course, home is more than just a place. The homes in which we grew up have to do with the very essence of who we are as persons. Home conjures up thoughts of love and loyalty, of rules and tradition, of drama and comedy, of character building and affirmation. But if we are honest, it also reeks of messy baggage, of skirmishes and fights, of pushing each other's buttons and making mistakes. Home is, after all, complex, the place of our proudest achievements and our most heartbreaking hurts. In today's gospel lesson that Peggy read for us from Luke, Jesus has returned home to Nazareth, a small town where we can assume that everybody knew everybody else's business. We have no idea how long Jesus has been away. Some scholars believe that he had spent several years in the desert as a disciple of John the Baptist, or as part of a pietistic sect that was called the Essenes. Perhaps he kept his father's carpentry business going until he was called into public ministry. No matter, Joseph and Mary's boy child has now grown into a man, and according to his reputation, which has preceded him, a successful man at that. There is nothing quite like a hometown boy or girl that makes good, and doubtless the town of Nazareth was abuzz. Mary, his mother, was busy preparing the home and looking forward to fussing over her eldest son. And probably like most mothers, checking to see if he was eating enough and whether he could use a haircut. His relatives in town were holding their head up high, claiming that Jesus was one of their own. And being that Jesus was way past marriageable age, there might have been a few mothers insisting that their daughters would make an ideal wife for this man from Nazareth. Jesus, after a bit of traveling, made a conscious decision to return home. And the authorities, responding positively to his return, invited him to supply preach in the local synagogue, where neighbors and friends crowded in to hear what he had to say. You think that Jesus would have expected loyalty and enthusiasm, or at least a fair hearing by one's friends and family. And when Jesus chose to read from the prophet Isaiah, the words that would become the very essence of his ministry, everything was going along swimmingly. All those assembled knew these familiar words, clung to them, for many were the very poor, the captive and blind and oppressed to whom Jesus spoke. And so they were on their edge of their seats as Jesus began to teach and to preach. And then things began to go horribly wrong, which I know that all of us preachers have experienced firsthand when we expect that we are about to ruffle more than a few feathers of our flock. Jesus predicts this disaster when he declares, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown." Home may be where the heart is, but you see, the problem with home is that at some point we have to leave it, to launch out and to find our own voice, to grow beyond the child or teenager that people think that they have pegged down. And there is nothing that the people at home hate more than having to contend with a strange adult who has found his or her own voice, who has claimed his or her own life, who returns home to tell them exactly what he or she thinks. I will never forget the first time I returned home after having spent the first couple of months out of college. I was sitting watching TV and eating a snack around 11:30 at night when my mother pokes her head in and told me to turn off the TV and to come to bed. I know I looked at her like she was some alien from outer space who was invading my territory, and she knew in that glance that her complacent eldest daughter was no longer complacent after all. I suspect that it was both the content of the sermon and the authority with which Jesus delivered it that was offensive to all who heard him. But when push comes to shove, so often it's the illustrations that get us preachers in trouble. We make some grand generalities like take care of the poor and the sick, love your neighbor as yourself, and you are all nodding along to the music. But then we give a few examples of how that might look, and suddenly, as some of my folks have told me, you're meddling in my business, Pastor. Thus it was with Jesus' two illustrations. The first has to do with the prophet Elijah, who instead of seeking out a widow in Israel, seeks out a widow in the enemy territory of Sidon, who with her young son is on the very edge of starvation. And yet, through God's gracious power, both Elijah and this widow and her son are fed. Furthermore, in response to her obedience, the prophet works a miraculous restoration of her dead son. Out of all the people Jesus could have chosen, he points to a widow from a place his people despised. Surely Jesus could have heard the clearing of throats and a grumbling from those in the congregation. But no matter, Jesus proceeds to his second illustration. Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, who suffered from leprosy. Leprosy was a scourge upon the land of Israel, yet the prophet Elisha chooses to cure Naaman, an act of international hospitality meant to extol the power of God. But once again, of all the people worthy of healing, Jesus chooses an enemy of his people. He has worked up his once loyal and supportive following into a raging crowd who drive him out of the synagogue to a nearby cliff where they wish to silence him permanently. This hometown boy has changed, and he is a threat to their neat, defined way of thinking and believing and behaving. They just want to return to their old predictable way of life. And tragically, Jesus' phenomenal potential to change hearts and to heal lives demonstrated to strangers is lost forever to his own people. Think how Jesus must have felt. Shocked, hurt. Surely he must have mourned that he might never return to his hometown again. What an empty feeling to know that there never again will be an unlocked door, a light left on, a welcome home meal, or open arms to receive you. This homecoming celebration turned into a near mob lynching. So it was with a bit of sadness and self-fulfillment that Jesus walks among his naysayers and leaves his hometown in the dust. For he must move on with dignity and integrity. He must move on and fulfill his calling. He must move on and proclaim his message elsewhere. He must move on and be all that he is by the very nature and grace of the God who has made him and called him, no matter the pain or disappointment, no matter the looks of doubt or scorn, to be all that God had intended him to be. I think there's obvious pain in this narrative, but there is also hope-filled potential. First of all, the painful reality is that returning home is not always the idyllic event we envision. Home or hometown, that collection of people, events, and emotions we know most intimately, simply cannot meet our every need. There is often disappointment and disillusionment. We are, after all, imperfect people with our own quirks and foibles. We let each other down. We speak before we think. We listen without really hearing. Often we simply outgrow who we used to be and all that we just accepted as our world view. If we are fortunate, our families will grudgingly or happily accept us in our updated version and respect our decisions. Jesus may be disappointed with his experience at home, but he isn't hopeless about humankind. Several chapters later in Luke, Jesus will send out his disciples 2 by 2, expecting them to rely on the hospitality and generosity that they will find in the many homes that they will enter. He knew that there were towns and families where they would be rejected, and if that were the case, they were to move on until they found a village and homes where acceptance was offered, where love and respect was given them, where people treasured one another in a way that brought out the best in them. Home may be where the heart is, but needless to say, home is a complex and messy thing. As someone who has had a lifetime experience in counseling, I know about the complexities of home, the joy, and the sorrow. I'd like to invite you to travel back with me about 35 years ago to a time when my children, and perhaps some of yours, were around preschool or kindergarten age. Each day in the late afternoon, I would find my children, including Julia, back there with her sister Jenny, glued to the TV, where they would watch this dorky middle-aged man in a raggedy cardigan sweater and worn tennis shoes singing a high-pitched but soft voice, "It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor." Sometimes he sang a bit off-key. Then the show would proceed to have this man interact with a stuffed cat named Henrietta Pussycat and a mailman by the name of Mr. McFeely. I would stick my head in to see if the script ever changed, but nope. It was pretty much the same every day. It was all so simple and unsophisticated. I confess, as a college-educated and informed mother, I just didn't get it. Sesame Street with the Cookie Monster and Elmo who made me smile, or Reading Rainbow with his encouragement for children to read, these were great shows. But every day, my two girls were drawn to the carpet in the living room where they sat down yoga style in front of the TV. After a couple months of this, I decided to sit down with my kids and endure the whole of this show. It took me a few days to get the hang of things, but I began to see in the sweet simplicity of this one man was an understanding of a far more complex world. This was someone who knew how to draw children into his home and neighborhood, knew how to listen to them and talk their language, knew how to love and accept every child and neighbor unconditionally. He knew that a soft voice and gentleness and hospitality were more persuasive than swagger or sophistication. When the show ended with, "It's a good feeling to know you're alive, such a happy feeling, you're growing inside, and when you wake up ready to say, I think I'll make a snappy new day," and the promise, "I'll be back when the day is through, and I'll have more ideas for you, and you'll have things you want to talk about, I will too." No wonder kids couldn't wait to tune in the next day. When Fred Rogers died in 2003, we didn't lose a first-class actor, but there was a huge outpouring of grief and affection for this ordained Presbyterian minister with an enormous, genuine heart who invited others into his neighborhood, a home away from home, where they were treasured and told each day how proud they made him feel. Think how today's story of Jesus' homecoming, his return to his hometown, might have been different if they had embraced a son of their own, had listened with open minds to what he had to say, and even if it was all just a bit too much, had affirmed his ministry, sending him on his way with their blessing. Instead, Jesus left a clifftop of angry people and walked out of his neighborhood, where he would go on to find a home in Capernaum and in Bethany and amongst the women and the men that he called his disciples. But through it all, Jesus never gave up preaching and teaching the very vision and mission he proclaimed in Nazareth, and giving illustrations that would help or anger those who would listen. Whatever your experience of home, you are called to be a genuine, authentic self, a child of a God who loves you with an everlasting love. And like Jesus, you and I are called to embrace a vision of what God might have in store for us, and to go forth with dignity and integrity, to live a life of purpose, of faith, of hope, in a world that is our home, but for a brief while. May it be so for you and for me. Amen.